In the dim, labyrinthine corridors of an unnamed city, where shadows played tricks on perception and the scent of dampened bureaucracy hung heavy in the air, Josef K awoke one morning to a peculiar absence of clarity. The sunlight that usually pierced through his modest room's curtains was subdued, as though filtered through an unseen veil. He turned over on his stiff cot, eyes flickering open, only to find two strangers standing at the foot of his bed. "Who are you?" Joseph demanded, his voice cracking as the realization of their presence jolted him fully awake. "You know who we are," one of them replied curtly, his tone neither kind nor cruel, merely factual. He was dressed in a dark, threadbare suit, his hands clasped behind his back. Beside him, his companion, slightly shorter but equally dispassionate, nodded in agreement. "I do not," Joseph retorted, sitting up. The sense of violation, of these men standing in his private quarters uninvited, burned through him. "And how did you get in?" "That is not the question you should be asking," the taller man said, his gaze fixed but uninterested, as if Joseph were not entirely real to him. "You should be asking why." Joseph's mind raced, piecing together fragmented possibilities, yet none seemed plausible. He had not committed a crime, at least not one he was aware of. His life was, by all measures, ordinary. A bank clerk with an unremarkable routine, he had neither enemies nor ambitions grand enough to warrant attention. The very absurdity of the situation threatened to unhinge him. "And why?" Joseph finally asked, his voice trembling despite himself. "You are under arrest," the shorter man declared matter-of-factly, as though delivering an inventory list. "We are here to inform you." "Arrest?" Joseph exclaimed, a wave of indignation overtaking his earlier fear. "For what? What have I done?" "That is not our concern," the taller man interjected. "Our task is merely to notify you." "Notify me of what?" "Of the fact that you are now under arrest. Proceedings will follow." Joseph leapt from the bed, his anger fueling his movements. "Proceedings? What proceedings? This is preposterous. I demand to know the charges." The men exchanged a glance, a silent communication that Joseph could not decode. Finally, the shorter one spoke again. "That information is not available at this time. You will, however, receive instructions." "Instructions for what?" Joseph barked. "For your trial," the taller man answered, his voice betraying the slightest hint of boredom. Joseph's head spun. The word hung in the air like an omen, heavy and incomprehensible. "Trial? For what crime? What accusation?" He searched their faces for any crack in their impenetrable demeanor, but there was none. "I refuse to comply with this farce," Joseph declared, his chest heaving. "You misunderstand," said the taller man, his tone now tinged with a faint condescension. "Refusal is not an option. The trial is not contingent upon your agreement." Before Joseph could respond, the men turned in unison and walked toward the door. "Wait," he shouted after them, but they did not stop. By the time he reached the threshold, they had disappeared into the endless hallway beyond. Joseph stood there, trembling, the open door before him framing a corridor that seemed unnaturally long. The walls, painted a dull and peeling gray, stretched into a vanishing point that defied logic. The air was thick, oppressive, as though the building itself conspired against him. Returning to his room, Joseph paced, his thoughts unraveling into chaotic strands. Who were those men? What authority did they represent? And, most importantly, what crime had he supposedly committed? He found no answers, only a growing sense of unease that rooted itself in his chest. By mid-morning, a letter was slipped under his door. The envelope bore no address or seal, only his name scrawled in a shaky, unfamiliar hand. Inside, a single sheet of paper contained an address and a time, 12 p.m., Court of Inquiry. No explanation, no context, just the stark command. Joseph crumpled the letter in his fist, a surge of defiance surging through him. He considered ignoring it altogether, yet some insidious force compelled him otherwise. Perhaps it was fear, or perhaps it was the gnawing curiosity that whispered, "What if they're serious?" By noon, Joseph found himself standing before an unmarked building in a derelict part of the city. The facade was unremarkable, its windows shrouded in grime. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the faint odor of mildew and despair. A narrow staircase spiraled upward, its steps creaking under Joseph's weight as he ascended. At the top, a heavy wooden door loomed. Joseph hesitated before pushing it open, stepping into a room that defied all his expectations. It was not a courtroom, at least not in any conventional sense. The space was cramped, lined with mismatched furniture and illuminated by a single dim bulb that swung precariously from the ceiling. A group of people, their faces obscured by shadows, sat in silence, their attention fixed on Joseph as he entered. Josef K, a voice boomed from somewhere within the gloom. It was deep, resonant, and disconcertingly familiar, though Joseph could not place its origin. "Yes," he replied, his voice cracking slightly. "You stand accused," the voice continued, "though the nature of your offense is immaterial. What matters is your acknowledgement of the process." "What process?" Joseph demanded, stepping forward. "I don't even know what I'm accused of. This is madness." The room erupted into murmurs, the figures shifting uneasily in their seats. The voice spoke again, cutting through the din. "Your ignorance does not absolve you. The process is absolute." Joseph's protests fell on deaf ears. The figures seemed to blur, their features indistinct, their murmurs growing louder until they became a cacophony that drowned out his thoughts. The walls closed in, the air growing thicker, until Joseph felt as though he might suffocate. When he finally stumbled back into the street, the sunlight felt harsh, almost mocking. The trial had begun, though Joseph still had no idea what he was fighting against, or if resistance was even possible. Days turned into weeks and Joseph's life unraveled. The trial consumed him, an omnipresent specter that haunted his every moment. Bureaucratic summonses arrived at random intervals, each more cryptic than the last. The courtroom seemed to change locations without warning, its elusive nature mirroring the inscrutability of the charges against him.